Okay, so though I'm following how people are being joining up slowly, I think that we can start, and I think that people will come in time to see Roger's presentation, actually. So we are starting officially. Hello to everyone. And if I may joke a little bit, hello to you Europeans here from down under. Uh, Me and the colleague Jovica Pavlovic, who is also with us here, we have been here in Sydney at the Macquarie University for 3 weeks, actually. And so for us now it's 10 p.m. So lucky you that you are actually doing this in a normal time. But anyway, I'm more than pleased and honored really that we can finally come to the realization of this event. Professor Roger David Griffin and me started our conversation like a couple of months ago. And I'm really happy that we realized actually the whole this idea, and that the Institute of European Studies will really have the privilege of presenting you a lecture on March on Rome by Professor Roger David Griffin, who is actually for people who are dealing with political theory, history, and especially theory and history of fascism. Probably I wouldn't have to present him, but for those who are not really obliged to know everything about fascism coming from maybe different disciplines, I will just briefly say a couple of words. Professor Griffin has been working at Oxford Brookes University. And he is, of course, especially known as a historian and theoretician of fascism. He wrote a lot of very nice and useful books, if I may say. I will just mention some of the most famous one, especially his book from 1991, The Nature of Fascism, is one of the pillars of contemporary studies of fascism. Then his book from 2007, Fascism and Modernism, book from 2008, A Fascist Century, collection of essays. And he wrote many other books on terrorism, totalitarianism, and similar things, if I can say. We have to be fair to him and to say that he's doing also other stuff. I will just mention a book from 2016 on David Bowie called Golden Years, and many other things that he really pursued in his life. So anyway, we have really the pleasure of meeting him today with us. He will give us introductory lecture with the presentation he prepared on the March on Rome. And I have just to remind you that actually these days we are in a way marking or commemorating 100 years since the so-called March on Rome, which is usually treated as some kind of coup d'etat with which fascists in Italy, actually Mussolini seized the power, but you will see Professor Griffin has some other interpretation of these events. And I just wanted to use the opportunity to remind you about the conference, our, let me say, local or regional, in a way, conference on fascism that we held 1 month and a half ago with Professor Jovo Bakic, who is here with us, Professor Tihomir Cipek from Zagreb, and some other very well-known colleagues. So we, in a way, made some kind of introductory overview of the state of the problem of studying of fascism. And I see this as, let me say, some kind of peak of our dealing with this issue. And I will not take more of your time. I will ask Professor Griffin to take the floor and to give us presentation, as our colleague Srbuljub, who is technically organizing all of this, have just warned you. You may send comments or the questions through chat, and we will pose them afterwards, and Professor Griffin will be commenting, responding, and so on. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and Professor Griffin, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. I'm not in Australia. I'm sitting in a room in my house in Oxford. Outside is a beautiful sunny day, actually. We've had really bad, good weather. The weather is beautiful, but it shouldn't be this warm, and I am worried about global warming. So whenever I see a day like this, I feel both very happy but also very scared. I should explain why the talk you're going to see is a bit unusual. I'm not doing it live. I've done an audio PowerPoint presentation. And the reason for that is that I have a big problem as a lecturer of never being able to fit my talks into the time I'm given. So doing it as a recording gives me a certain amount of discipline and makes me stick to the subject. I'm afraid asking me to do a talk on the March on Rome is problematic because, as you will see in the talk, I argue that really the March on Rome is much more of a myth than a historical reality. But I also think that that's what's important about it, because I see so much modern history and modern politics being driven by myth. Unfortunately for humanists and rationalists and academics, I mean real academics, not academics working for a totalitarian regime, truth is complex, multifaceted, and nothing to get fanatical about. And I'm afraid what I learned from looking at the success of Trump and Putin, etc., is that the mythic energies that drove fascism, which you will see in the cult of the March of Rome, are still with us and still shaping our history. So I look forward to engaging with some of you after this talk and hope that it is intelligible to you. At least there are a lot of pictures to look at. So I look forward to listening to you and meeting you after the talk. Thank you very much. And I would also, before I forget, like to thank very much the Institute for European Studies and Misa Djokovic in particular for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you. Greetings from Oxford. I would love to actually be with you in person in Belgrade, but I'm afraid a family situation has prevented me from being there in person, though I would love to come to Belgrade one day. It is on my bucket list, as we say in English. And I'd like to thank very much Misa Djurkovic, if I pronounced that properly, for inviting me to give a talk to the Institute of European Studies on the March on Rome. Now, this is a long PowerPoint, and I certainly don't intend to read out all the slides or give each slide the attention it deserves. I hope that it will give you a sort of overview of the complexity of the event and what we call in English a non-event, and that I will have at least provided some food for thought. I look forward to the live discussion because this will have been circulated in advance. People who are really interested in this might be advised, after they've listened to me for 50 minutes, presumably after a cup of coffee and a lie down, to actually look at the slides without my commentary so that they can actually take in some of the points. So by definition, this is a rather rushed oral commentary, and I have touched on a lot of things which really require a lecture in their own right. But I hope that even without my actual physical presence, I will have fulfilled the brief which Misa has given me. Now, perhaps I should explain the rather cryptic title. The famous fascist slogan is marciare, non marcire, which means march, do not rot. I have done a typically English play on words to call it marciare e marcire, because I am going to end up by pointing out that there is something essentially corrupting and rotten in the way the far right generally, and fascism in particular, uses marching as a metaphor and an activity as part of the mobilization of forces which are extremely corrupting of democracy and ultimately doomed to failure at the cost of great inhumanity. But the slogan itself, interestingly enough for me, which I didn't realize till I did some research, did not originate with fascism, but with the political futurist movement headed by Marinetti, and it's a typical sort of futurist idea of action over apathy. Incidentally, it's been pointed out by scholars such as Selena Daly that the futurist contribution to the interventionist movement has been massively overplayed by academics who've been taken in by the power of Marinetti's personality and rhetoric. It was far less effectual than the actual movements or groupings created by syndicalists and D'Annunzio and by Mussolini, all of whom used more effective ways of rallying energy and backing for the interventionist movement. But nevertheless, the slogan lived on, and I have hung this talk on it. The image with Marciare non marcire on it is interesting because it's actually a postcard, and it was a postcard which was circulated in order to make a link between the interventionist movement and the assassination of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, who was killed by Guglielmo Oberdan as part of an attempt to rally the forces of patriotism to take back the part of Italy that was being still occupied by the Austrians. And I think it's already quite an important aspect of the march as a concept that emerges from this postcard. Because if you think about it, by making a link between that irredentist assassination and the intervention in the First World War, not only was the postcard making a link between futurism, patriotism, and intervening in history, but it gives the celebration of marching a subtext of making history, of actually doing what Walter Benjamin calls exploding the continuum of history, which in the famous thesis on the philosophy of history, Benjamin links to the idea that you carry out an act, presumably a violent act, a revolutionary act, which allows fragments of or shards of messianic time to enter chronological time. So I do think that there's a sort of quite an important concept already in that postcard which relates to the March on Rome. And if you actually drill a bit further into that idea of the march and what the march does as a way of acting on history, I'd like to introduce somebody who is far less famous as a psychologist than Jung or Freud, but I still think it's an important insight, and I've given you the reference there. In Mein Kampf, Hitler, don't forget, he's had a failed putsch, and he has not yet succeeded in mobilizing the masses. And he shows that in one passage a certain envy of the success of Marxist marches and rallies in Weimar Germany. And he talks about the way it is not the theory of Marxism that has won over millions of workers to Marxism. It's, quote, the gigantic mass demonstrations and the marches of 100,000 men that have burned into the shabby little man a proud conviction that even though he is a poor worm, he is part of a great dragon whose fiery breath will someday send the hated privileged class the world of the hated privileged classes, that should read, up in flames and bring final victory to the lower class dictatorship. In other words, he's already identified the power of ritual politics and symbolic actions as a way of mobilizing masses, and in that mobilization, individuals are welded into a force which is much more powerful than the sum of its parts. And of course, it's very obvious that this relates to Gustave Le Bon's recognition of the difference between individual psychology and crowd psychology in La Psychologie des Foules of 1895. I'm not at all suggesting that Hitler read that. I'm just suggesting that the recognition of the power of the masses, especially after the First World War, was in the air. Now, my premise in attempting to give this keynote is that it is possible to make a number of different readings of the March on Rome according to the perspective and assumptions adopted. And I can only obviously scratch the surface of this, because according to the aspect of fascism or Nazism or extremism or modernity that you're interested in, or even just Italian politics, you will pick up different features. But so what I propose to do is, rather than focus on a single aspect, I've adopted a sort of what could be called a cubist or futurist approach, by treating the March on Rome as a dynamically multifaceted event, and in fact, as we'll realize if you don't already, a sort of non-event in actual lived experience. So what I am doing is offering a glimpse of, or a sketch, or an introduction, or a portal, to use that phrase, to several different perspectives and readings and images of Mussolini's famous march, which are much more obvious 100 years later than they were at the time. And these different aspects or images of the march ripple out from the actual events, and as I say, non-events, unfolding in historical, commemorative, scholarly, and mythic time. And to ground that approach, I think this famous triptych is fascinating, actually, and sort of relevant. I mean, the fascist aesthetics, some of the theoreticians and artists of fascism and commentators on fascism were preoccupied and obsessed with its dynamism and the fact that it was not one thing, that it was full of energy, that it affected various spheres of reality all at once. And I do find this fascinating. 1935, Bruschetti paints this triptych, fascist synthesis, and if you look to the right and left, the side panels, you can see already the celebration of aesthetically choreographed, uniformed men already placed in a way that completely guts them of individualism and individual identity and welds them into a force, in this case a military force, a destructive force, of course, which is greater than you could have assumed by treating them as a group of individuals. Incidentally, this was the age of the Busby Hollywood films, and there was a fascination with choreographing masses, which you also get, of course, in Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will and Olympiade, the documentary film of the Olympic Games. And I find it quite relevant that Claudio Foggu, who writes a very important book on the central shift from observing history to making history in the fascist imaginaire, actually uses the central panel of the same triptych. So in a way, what I'm trying to make a complicated link with is between the activist, interventionist approach to history that you already got with futurism and with the interventionist movement in the First World War, and the cult of ritual politics and the aestheticized or mythicized march, which is at the center of what became known as the March on Rome, which was a mythic event rather than a real event, and much more related to the historic imaginary than anything to do with actual history. It's crucial to realize the difference between studying history and seeing history as somehow intervenable in and remakeable. Incidentally, Osborne's study of the politics of time, a central point of his book is the fact that time becomes malleable, time becomes intervenable in, the future can be reshaped. We are not part of some natural progression which is in some respect inexorable. So I've made up a new word because I like doing that. So this keynote can be seen as a sort of Dekatych, which just means 10 panels and not 3. It's interesting that the conference brochure or program is actually described as a diptych, which is 2 panels. Well, this is going to be a metaphorical Dekatych. I'm going to just point to 10 images which open up onto different perspectives on the March on Rome. And these are the first 5. The chaotic mess of the actual events of October 22, their immediate propagandist transformation into fascism's foundation myth of a march on Rome, which becomes this great mythic turning point in history, the Sorelian implications of this mythicization, the modernist interpretation of the march as the enactment of the futurists' dynamic concept of reality, and the counterfactual or mythic reading of the establishment of the fascist regime in January 1925 as the culmination, the natural legacy of the climax and the fruition of the March on Rome. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in what actually happened between the 28th and the 31st of October, because it's really detailed, complicated stuff, and we're not here to really talk about that. And I'm sure there are people listening to this or watching this who know far more about it than I do, because I'm not an Italian historian. But so my first image, though, is the picture of some squadristi crossing the famous, and you can look it up because it's a very ancient Roman bridge, the Ponte Salario Salaria, on the outskirts of Rome, assembling for what still isn't clear, but there was, in some way or other, it was going to be a challenge to the state or some sort of fantasy coup d'etat. I really don't think that many of the soldiers on that bridge had much of an idea of what was going to happen, unless they'd convinced themselves, as revolutionaries tend to, that somehow if you march around the walls of the Jericho of the state, they will somehow fall down under their own weight. Of course, the Italian state, no matter how weak and corrupt and ineffectual, was far more powerful than the squadristi movement when these men were walking over the bridge. Now, I'd just like to do a little side swipe at the way Wikipedia and Google knowledge can be quite misleading about the March on Rome. I've put here caveat lector. You get the Encyclopedia Britannica. The March on Rome was an insurrection by which Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy in late October 1922. I mean, really, it was not an insurrection in any meaningful sense of the term, and he did not come to power except in the democratic sense that he was made head of state, but it's quite misleading that, and it makes a causal link between an insurrection which didn't actually take place and him coming to power, which is an ambiguous phrase. Wikipedia, the march was, quote, an organized mass demonstration and a coup d'etat in October 22, which resulted in Benito Mussolini's PNF ascending to power in the kingdom. Absolutely not. I mean, it was not it was pretty organized, though not. I still think it was organized up to the point of squadristi assembling at various points on the outskirts of Rome. It was not a coup d'etat. That's exactly what it wasn't, which implies a sort of putsch or an armed insurrection which seizes power. It absolutely did not. That was not it at all, and it did not result in the PNF ascending to power in the Kingdom of Italy, unless again you mean that the period in which the PNF was the dominant party in the Italian Chamber of Deputies was somehow already full power, the conquest of power. So I just think this is quite misleading. And how about this for a wonderful exercise in alternative facts? I've given you the reference here. Mussolini's black shirts assembled together on the plain of the River Po outside Rome. No, and took position at strategic and planned points. Well, partly, but they were waiting for instructions outside the centre of Rome. Armed fascist troops gathered in the outskirts before marching into the city. They marched up to the king, they did not, and threatened him to the point of surrender. Are you joking? Victor Emmanuel III resigned and was forced to give his full power to Mussolini. Absolute nonsense. What is this guy on? These are what are called howlers in English, and in Italian they're known as papere, which means a duck. So I'm not quite sure what the finger does there, but really. But what interests me is the way the fascists' own myth of the March on Rome actually has contaminated pseudo-reliable academic information decades later. And I'm just going to zip through this, but it's actually the number of the actual gap between the myth of Rome, of the March on Rome, and actual history is really quite complicated. But this is my summary of it. The march never happened. There was neither an insurrection nor a coup d'etat. The king did not resign and did not bring Mussolini to power as a fascist dictator, nor did the PFI achieve a monopoly of parliamentary power, though it tried very hard to by fixing the voting system, etc. The integrity of Parliament and the state was never threatened by fascist squads in 1922. The so-called march was initially a poorly thought-through threat of a fascist show of force. It was a gamble whose outcome was so uncertain that Mussolini waited in the offices of his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, in Milan, to see how the government would react, and had a car ready to take him to Switzerland if it failed. As so often, he winged it. If you don't know that word in English, it meant, he did something that Johnson, our late lamented Prime Minister, did a lot, which was he basically improvised and hoped for the best. Vittorio Emanuele III was initially prepared to sign the state of emergency decree proposed by the Factor government, and by 7 a.m. on the 28th of October, the measures for the repression of the insurrection by the military, including the arrest of its leaders at midday, had been posted on walls of the city. There is little doubt that the army, the state army, the Italian army, would have neutralized the threat to the state before any show of force or rally took place. But by late morning, the king had revoked the order, whereupon Factor resigned as head of state. And that created the opportunity for the king to appoint Mussolini prime minister instead. So really, it's a really complicated set of events, but it's absolutely no sign of a march and no sign of a coup d'etat. In other words, the March on Rome is what, thanks to Trump, we can now call fake history. Summoned by the king, Mussolini arrived from Milan early on the 30th of October at Rome Central train station in civilian clothes. We'll see those in a minute. Having spent the night in a comfortable wagon-lit, hardly heroic, he presented the king with his list of appointments and secured the king's permission for the black shirts to hold a triumphal parade the next day. So nothing to do with the 28th of October. And he got permission for this parade, and it was not some sort of... the parade has been somehow elided in the minds of people with the originally planned threatening march, but they're separate things. It was not until the 31st of October that about 25,000 exhausted squadristi held a sfilata, a parade in central Rome, with no Mussolini in sight, a celebration which was largely met by the apathy of the Roman public rather than by a tide of populist enthusiasm. There's nothing to suggest there was some sort of oceanic assembly, as they're called, of popular enthusiasm. After this, they were immediately sent home, and of course, Mussolini wasn't there. He was up to his neck in negotiations and plans about the new government. There was thus no conquest of power and no sense of the birth of a new Italy or even a major crisis. Well, maybe I've overstated that. For many, the leader of the PFI had simply become prime minister, and the paramilitaries who had defeated communism in the Biennio Rosso had left. For many squadristi, the whole sequence of events had culminated in an anticlimax and a sellout to parliamentary democracy. This interpretation seemed to intransigenti, the sort of hardline fascists, to be corroborated by, one, the creation of the PFI in 1921 after the Biennio Rosso, the transformation of fascism into a party, which was not the original idea in San Sepolcro fascism, and two, the reorganization of the squadra as the voluntary militia for national security 5 months later, which destroyed the autonomy of the fasci and their ras. Here is Mussolini in Borghese, and here is a scene from the parade. Yes, they had a parade, but I don't get the sense of it being a massively watched moment, and it is interesting that on that same day, on the 31st of October, the squadristi take a detour to actually salute the king. I mean, compare that with the account that he somehow surrendered to them and then resigned. I mean, really, I couldn't make it up. Well, that man or woman did make it up. So this was a very different set of events from those implied by the March on Rome. But what is interesting, and here we come to our first image of unpacking the myth of the March on Rome. So with image 2 of our Dekatych, we enter the real subject of my talk, which is the mythicization of the March on Rome, which we've already established didn't actually happen. There was no March on Rome. But already the next day, and this is remarkable because Mussolini has only just been called to Rome the day before, and he's in a train and he gets off at the station, central station in Rome, in Borghese, and yet his newspaper has already started the mythicization process. He talks about the irresistible and victorious uprising, fascist uprising, riscossa, rather obscure word. It means riscossa civile means a sort of civilian rebellion. So this is already being greeted as a turning point in Italian history, some sort of great breakthrough for fascism. And I find that amazing, just how clever Mussolini and fascism generally was in the mythicization of events. And even more remarkable, I think, is that already by the end of 1922, Umberto Paradisi, who is a sort of creative journalist, filmmaker, critic, has turned the events of the 3 days in October into a film with the fascist title Hanoi, which is probably from the Arditi, and I've never quite understood it, though it is a fascist slogan, a militaristic slogan to us, subtitled Dalla Sagra, from the, well, that's difficult to translate as well. He famously, Mussolini, gave a talk to Naples where a week before the events, where he talked about the myth of fascism and the coming assault on power, to the conquista di Roma. Here, Rome has been conquered. And we have this idea of conquista di Roma, and it's only a short step from that to the idea of the conquista di Stato, the conquest of the state. And this was actually made within weeks of the actual events, and in a surge of what I call fascist mythopoeia, which is the creation of myths. And there we are. And it's already an official film of the Partito Nazionale Fascista. I find it quite remarkable. And you actually... if you can read Italian, though it's written in this strange German Gothic script, the official representation of the unforgettable events, civiltà. I mean, already we got anima eroica. I mean, this is already deeply into mythicization. And note the fascist symbol, the fasces, and the star. You know, this is really powerful. And what we're dealing with here is something that Georges Sorel, in his analysis of how revolutions take place, we're dealing with the transformation of the non-event of the march at the end of October, because it's not to be confused with the parade, which was not a march, into what's called, he calls, a mobilizing myth. Georges Sorel explored the mobilizing, regenerative, palingenetic, that's my word for revolutionary or rebirth, the power of images associated with collective action, and you can read that through when you like. But I would suggest anybody for whom this is new, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, should, if it is new, check out Georges Sorel's concept of revolution, regeneration, rebirth, and the power of images and the power of collective action. And I would emphasize the fact that for Georges Sorel, the event, the mythic event that he was interested in as an example was not a fascist march, because in the early 1900s that didn't exist, but he was already impressed by the power of the trade union movement and the syndicalists, and the mobilizing power of the image of the idea of the strike. And here is a scene from the 1926 UK general strike, which embodies to a Sorelian the power, it failed, but it was still a major disruption of the power of the state. And of course, it's not new in this. It's not new, the idea of the march. I mean, you can see, if you're looking for other historical examples, the Exodus, and there's the march of Napoleon to Paris when he got away from Elba, and the Salt March of Gandhi, and there's the great trek of the fascist South African Afrikaner movement, the Ossever Brandwach, and of course Mao's Long March, and the Selma March of the Civil Rights Campaign in America. So I would like you to locate, I'm inviting you to locate the March on Rome within quite a long history of mythicizing, mobilizing marches. So now we're through to the next image, which is futurism, which we started with the postcard. Here is a 1913 Velocità Astratta on the eve of the First World War, the celebration of energy, dynamism, and abstraction, abstract velocity. Now, why is it in the middle of this talk on the March on Rome? Well, because Balla, he must have been a pretty good painter, actually painted this on the back of Arte Astratta. He based it on this photo, which you can read what it's about. And I think this is quite remarkable, because what we have here is Balla making a direct link between the idea of speed and abstract velocity and the idea of the march as a futurist event, a futurist intervention into history. And I'm running myself out of time, so I'll move on. But that's another part of the proliferation of perspectives. Now, there's a very obvious follow-up image to that, which is this is a photo of Mussolini giving this famous speech, if it could be called a speech, on the 3rd of January 1925, in which he announces the establishment of the dictatorship. Now, the point I'm actually making is not a historical one. It's still part of the mythicization. I'm going to argue that what happened in the evolution of the myth of the March on Rome is that the events of January 25 and that year in which liberal democracy was replaced by a fascist state is actually assumed to be the culmination of the March on Rome in late October, which has now become a sort of reality, a mythical reality. It's become reified. Now, actually, when you look at the reality or the history of the events that led to the speech on the 3rd of January, they are again nothing to do with some natural consequence or plan which was hatched back in 1922. In fact, the murder was carried out by squadristi and one of the standard interpretations was that the idea was to push Mussolini into radicalizing his own movement and actually put an end to the parliamentary manifestation of fascism and deliver the promised revolution, the revolution that was promised back in Milan in March 1919. So actually, again, as he was with the March on Rome, so-called, Mussolini himself was very uncertain about how his enemies or opponents would react to the murder. And it was only when he was convinced that the church, the monarchy, parliament, the general public was not going to really do anything concrete to rein him in or get rid of him as head of state, that he took this decisive step. So there's no way in which the conquest of the state should actually be allied with the mess of the March on Rome. But in fact, I think that at that moment, March actually takes on metaphorical significance as a conquest of the state. In other words, the March on Rome embraces and brings together, fuses together in the minds of fascists, both a physical march, which was as it partly planned and didn't happen, and the fact of the conquest of the state in 1925. Now, obviously, all these things really require complete lectures in their own right, and I've got to a point where I've only got about 5 minutes to go through the rest of the talk. So now you're used to me, as it were, I will zoom on. I'm going to bring in 5 further perspectives really worth dwelling on. So here is my sixth image, and this is an image from the exhibition of the Fascist Revolution 1932, which was taken to be occurring in the 10th anniversary of the new fascist era. And what the fascists did was introduce a new calendar using Roman numerals for the year after the years that had gone by since the March on Rome. And this is a room dedicated to celebrating the March on Rome and commemorating it. And note the date very prominently, 28th of the 10th of 22. As we know, nothing happened on the 28th in terms of any sort of conquest of power. And this was occurring, the exhibition, in the 10th year, Roman numeral 10 of the new fascist era. And if you want proof that Mussolini himself conceptualized fascism as inaugurating a new era, not just in Italy, but in the rest of the world, you should read the part of the article on fascism that he wrote along with Gentile. He followed Gentile's part with his own section on the political and social doctrine of fascism, which was then printed as a separate piece as La Dottrina del Fascismo, where you see very clearly his vision of fascism as marking a new era, replacing the liberal democratic era. And that obviously needs far more exploration than I've been able to give it. The other area that I would have loved to have gone into in much more detail, but I can only skim past this, is the way the marching, and I'm not saying that the fascists established this alone, because the militarization of society had happened massively in the First World War, but certainly the fascist cult of the march and of marching squadristi and black shirts had a massive impact on all extreme right-wing and fascist movements throughout the 1930s. And if we move round, these are marching fascists in Britain under Mosley, and then to the right, Salgado in Brazil, the AIB, and in Holland under Mussert, the Dutch version of the National Socialist movement. In the bottom, we've got marching women for once in Norway under Quisling, and then we've got Rexists bottom right. And in the interwar period, it wasn't just pure fascists who were marching. I mean, on the left of this slide, we have the Romanian Iron Guard and the Falange in Spain, both of whom were genuinely fascistic and wanted a new order. But on the right, we have, interestingly, on the bottom, a parade for the Metaxas regime. Now, the Metaxas regime was very influenced by fascism and wanted to show that it felt part of the fascist era, but it was not actually radically fascist. And on the top, much closer to home for you, there's a march of the Hlinka Guard. Now, the Hlinka Guard is the most fascist and fascist influenced of the far right in Slovakia, but most experts would agree with me that the actual regime that ruled Slovakia in the Nazi era was not technically fascist, but it was a fascist collaborator. It was a puppet regime of fascism, even though its Catholicism stopped it being fully fascist. The words of the BUF marching song, which was sung to the tune of the Horst Wessel-Lied, which was a Nazi famous marching song, and you can see the cult of marching in that, marching legions. I've given you the text of the Horst Wessel-Lied, where you can see this cult of marching men. And of course, now we're through to image 8. The March on Rome, or the myth of it, had a massive effect on Hitler himself. In 1923, he attempts his own putsch. And here we have already we had the idea of of the SA and the marching uniformed men, which would have probably happened independently of Italian fascism. But it's known that the Mussolini and Mussolini's tactics for trying to interrupt democratic history had a very deep impact on Hitler. This is a commemorative march in which Hitler is celebrating under the Third Reich the putsch, an actual failed putsch, and on the 11th of November 1935 in the Odeonsplatz in Munich, the Gefallenen, those who had died, the martyrs of the failed putsch, were reburied and entered what Hitler says in his speech is Nazi immortality. So the idea of a conquest and a riscossa and a marching into history is absolutely vital. And of course, the Nazis took marching to a higher, almost metaphysical level. I mean, I think the picture of marching Nazis through Nuremberg is really quite extraordinary. And of course, the Nazis created their own particular variant of the march, the goose step. And far more importantly, even than the actual march, was the mythic march. The idea of the Hitler Youth, the idea of the stormtroopers, the idea of the support for Hitler. Now, these are the SA on the left, and that's a scene from a very important Nazi film called Hitler Junge Quecks. And here's a famous poster of Hitler with this curious religious Holy Spirit above him, and the breaking of the new dawn. And look at the proliferation of Nazis in the background, and him leading with of course the flag, which is the other part of all this, which all comes together in the Nazi imagination of collective power, the power of the Volksgemeinschaft, the power of the nation, the power of the army, etc., etc. And if you want to see a beautiful image that follows on from this, it's the opening scene in The Triumph of the Will, where when Hitler's plane gets low enough, you see not ordinary people wandering around in Nuremberg, but this regimented line of ants in formation marching towards some meeting point in order to celebrate the arrival of the Führer. And I think the centrality of the march to the fascist and the military and the autocratic and the power-crazed imaginaire is really significant. And of course, this cult of the march as a symbol of right-wing power certainly didn't finish with the end of Nazi Germany. This is the Unite the Right March in 2017, neo-Nazis in Dortmund in 2018. More recently, this is a rally of Fratelli d'Italia, who I'm not calling fascist or Nazi, but they are certainly right-wing, and they embody an energy which nevertheless is symbolized on the flags by the fiamma tricolore, which is the symbol of a party which is called Fiamma Tricolore, but that it is actually mostly associated in Italy with the eternal flame at Predapio, or the flame of which commemorates Mussolini, who was buried there. So I think the march, the rally, the flags, the throng, this is all very much part of the legacy of the March on Rome. It wasn't created by it, but it was a pivotal part of the fascist imagination. And I'd like to end by considering the democratic response to this. I find it quite interesting that a Belfast-born director, Mark Cousins, presented a film in this year, which is the centenary of the March on Rome, called The March on Rome. They have Mussolini seen through a window with water trickling down. This is Mark Cousins, but very importantly for us today, I think, he makes specifically the link between, this is obviously long before she actually became Italy's prime minister, between Mussolini's rise to power and Giorgia Meloni's rise to power, and it actually caused quite a stir when she was placed into this documentary film about the March on Rome, and Fratelli d'Italia obviously found it very offensive. I don't think she is a fascist. I think she's a populist with quite a pick and mix ideology, but she certainly has fascist roots, and her party has fascist roots. She is Italy's new head of state, and some members of her party on Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 28th of January were photographed doing the fascist salute. You can take from that what you will. The Biennale in Venice, which presented Cousins' film, also presented a very interesting anti-fascist post-war film demystifying the March on Rome, with famous actor, two very famous comic actors or actors, Vittorio Gassman and Ugo Tognazzi. And this is a very interesting demystification and satire and deflation of the idea of the March on Rome, which I think is part of what we have to do in conferences like this. And we also have to realize that the march in itself is not right-wing. It was actually turned into the name of a political party by Macron. And there have been some glorious examples of anti-militaristic, anti-fascist, anti-autocratic marches, New York and London marches against the Gulf War, anti-Orban rally in 2018, an anti-fascist rally in Rome in 2021. And here is, I think, a very courageous march against the Iranian morality police in Iran very recently. And we should not forget the mass rallies against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And again, very courageously in February 2022, the anti-war march in Moscow of these wonderful civilians. And more recently, very courageous civilians in Russia. And I would say this is the real silent majority in Russia, in a regime which has made even mention of a war illegal, etc. This is a more recent march by courageous civilians protesting against the war. And note the difference between a right-wing march and a democratic march. Note how unregimented and unorchestrated this march is. Now, closer to home, I was intrigued to note when I did a bit of research on Belgrade this summer that in August, what I would regard as the religious and anti-democratic right held a large march in Serbia to save the country from the degeneracy of fluid sexuality in its midst, and some of the posters being carried were those of Putin, which I find really quite extraordinary. But it was also reassuring to note that the following month, not that long ago, the LGBTQ community held its own march undeterred by the marching of the left, of the far right. Note the rain that accompanied the LGBTQ march, probably implying the anger of divine forces. So in the last 50 minutes, what I've tried to do is start off with a brief examination of the nature of the events of the end of October 1922, which show that really there was no march on Rome or any conquest of power. But having established that, what is extremely apparent is that the fascist regime put a lot of energy into celebrating the constructed or mythicized march as a cornerstone of the regime, of the renewal of historical time, of the fascist era, and of the conquest of power, and that this actually then, in its own way, created a series of mythic events, exhibitions. It informed the doctrine of fascism, and it informed the whole way. Not just many Italians, but many historians have reconstructed in their minds the fascist era in Italy and outside Italy. I've tried to establish the idea that the apparent success of the march had an impact on Hitler and the rise of Nazism, and that more generally it became an established part of what is sometimes called the fascist style of politics, the ritual, liturgical style of politics, which is one of the major features of fascist practice and of what Emilio Gentile brilliantly explores in his book on the sacralization of politics under the fascist regime. So I put a lot of emphasis on the Sorelian mythic power of the march, and I ended up by pointing out that the march is an established aspect of politics in the modern world, both for the right and for the left. In terms of my original title, which you've probably forgotten by now, which is Marciare e marcire, I would argue that the march is actually a symptom of the weakness of fascism, of the spurious nature of fascist politics, of the fact that ultimately it can be reduced to little more than a pathological myth of society and the future, which legitimizes mass murder and mass violence, and that in a way the march embodies the rottenness in liberal and democratic and humanistic terms of the far right generally. And I have finalized or finally highlighted the fact that though the far right operation of the mythic power of the march lives on, so does the democratic and humanistic power of the march, so that the march is deeply ambivalent. But rather than leave you on this very abstract and dry analytical note, I was drawn by the passage in George Orwell's 1984, which gives a sort of a psychological insight into the fascist march, which I find very attractive. And this is a passage from a speech by Julia, this hedonist who avoids engagement with the regime by enjoying sexual pleasure. And she has seduced Wilson, and she makes this comment on why the totalitarian party embodied in Big Brother is so keen on a sort of puritanical restriction of sex and sexual enjoyment and sexual exploration. And I cannot help but make a link with the far-right reaction to and prejudice against LGBT LGBTQ orientations in many right-wing regimes, of religious right, Putin right, and it seems as very much in terms of Orthodox and Christian right. And she says to Wilson, when you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. They, the regime, the autocratic regime, cannot bear you to feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour, like milk that goes off, sex gone sour, gone rotten. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and the 3-year plans and the 2 minutes hate and all the rest of their bloody rot? Now, I like the idea that the march is a male chauvinist displacement of energy, but I should add to that I'm not meaning this in the Freudian and Marxist Freudian sense that Wilhelm Reich explored in his famous book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. I really mean this in a way that has been beautifully, even if it took a long time in terms of pages and images, beautifully explored by Karl Teverleit in his male fantasies. And here he is very interested in the idea that there is something pathological about fascism as a fantasy, as a vision of the world, as a form of behavior, which is deeply bound up with misogyny and a fear of flow, a fear of spontaneity. And he brings it down to a much more powerful concept, as far as I'm concerned, which is that of individuation. This is more Jungian than Freudian. And in the course of the first volume, called Women, Floods, Bodies and History, we find this passage. That is how fascism translates internal states into massive external monuments or ornaments as a canalization system, a system of rechanneling psychic energies, which large numbers of people flow into, where their desires can flow, at least within monumentally enlarged preordained channels, where they can discover that they are not split off and isolated, but that they are sharing the violation of prohibitions with so many others, preferably with all others. That is why these masses can't stand to see one man marching alone alongside their great blocks of human bodies. I think that's a wonderful way of imagining the fascist, especially the Nazi march, blocks of human bodies which have completely crushed any sort of individualism. Such a man isn't participating in their forbidden games, because the other aspect of this is, as a crowd, as a regimented body of people, fascism licenses atrocities which the individual would not perform. You see this very much in the Ukraine war, for example, in the atrocities in Bucha and which are being daily discovered by the Ukrainians as they liberate their country. Worse yet, he is observing them. In other words, the fascist does not want to be observed by the critical individual when he or she is part of this mass, this orchestrated, regimented, choreographed mass. And how can you let yourself be observed when you are in the process of turning into a stream and becoming God? I think that's fantastic, that you can see the participation in a fascist march as the shift from being an individual into being part of a stream, or what Hitler called the process of turning from a worm into part of a great dragon, and thereby becoming a god, a shift from impotence to potency. Now, the idea of the one man marching alone immediately evokes this famous photo, and the refusenik who will not be part of the block of human bodies. This photo is not of marching bodies, but of saluting bodies, and it is famous for an obvious reason. So here we have all the fascist salutes. In Italy it was called the Roman salute, and it was called the Hitler greeting in Germany, and it has remained the archetypal symbol of the fascist mindset. And Freudo-Marxists might point out the obvious phallic implications of the outstretched arm as a false indicator of an inner impotence. I am only potent within the crowd. I have no power in my individual humanistic personality. But in the middle of all this mass of outstretched arms, there is one guy who refuses to be part of this, and he doesn't hide away. He sits there smiling with his arms folded. And for me, he embodies the refusal to march in this sense in the negative right-wing, anti-human, anti-democratic, mindless sense of the term. So inwardly, I believe that we should all be part of a march for progress and a march for humanity, but we should never, ever inwardly give in to the seductive power of the right-wing march. I hope I have given you a bit of food for thought, and that all in our own ways we can do the equivalent of marching, even if it is only keeping our minds free from fanaticism and taking a stand against inhumanity, like as the Ukrainians are so magnificently as I speak, when we are called upon to do so by real history and not by fake history. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry if I missed last minute. I had some technical problems here, so I had to get out to return back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, everything's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank to Serba for facilitating all of this. And I'm sure this will be very interesting in many ways. So for the time being, we got one question, and I will start with it from our colleague Rajko Petrovic. Can you see that?
I can, but I can't understand it.
Yeah. Actually, our colleague is Hispanist, actually, and at the conference that I mentioned, he made some overview of the treatment of the fascism within the Hispanic world, including the South America and so on. So actually, the whole thing is very much referring to Stanley Payne ideas about Franco, and still existing debates about the nature of Franco's regime, if it was a kind of fascism or authoritarianism, or if I can add a little bit, could we define it differently, maybe in a different epoch, like in the 30s or in the 50s, 60s, and so on. So please.
I have a position which is very close to that of Stanley Payne. Both of us, when we write about the theory of fascism, do something which is quite difficult for people to agree with if they've been brought up under a Soviet system, because for the Soviet and the far left, fascism is not a revolutionary force. It's a form of reaction, and it's deeply connected to capitalism. But both Stanley Payne and I, and this is really what I've spent my academic career on, insist that actually fascism in its own intent, in its own mind, was a revolutionary force, and it did not just want to resist the rise of the left, or to stop the anarchy of democracy. It wanted to replace both communism and democracy, but also traditional conservatism in a new order. Now, if you then have a look at, say, Portugal, it's quite clear. I mean, Salazar was anti-liberal and anti-left, but he actually stopped the progress of the blue shirts because the blue shirts were calling for a new Portugal. Now, he called his state the new state, Estado Novo, but he didn't actually want to empower a populist force a mass mobilization of the Portuguese to create a really radical new regime. And the same is true, I believe, of Franco. Franco knew he did not want the left to be in power, but when he was confronted with the Falange, now the Falange really was very much influenced by fascism and Nazism. They wanted a new Spain with a new type of economy and an emancipated populist masses, but they also wanted to retain Catholicism. So it was a sort of conservative revolution. Franco, when he created his new state, he merged the Falange with the Catholic reactionary forces and created a hybrid, which was never radically fascist because he remained dictator. And then when the war started going against the Axis powers, he defascistized Spain, the Spain that emerges into the post-war period. If it had been a fascist state, it would have been occupied by the Allies, but instead, very cleverly, he puts the Falange element on the back burner. He brings forward the Opus Dei and the Catholic Church, and he ends up with a conservative Catholic authoritarian state, which has NATO bases in Spain and British tourists. Now, can you imagine the Third Reich or fascist Italy having American NATO bases? So for me, Franco is the example of somebody who wanted Spain to be part of the fascist era, as Vargas in Latin America, as Japan was part of the fascist era, but technically Japan and Vargas and Franco and Salazar and Dollfuss and Pilsudski, these were not really fascists. They wanted to symbolize that they were part of the fascist era, but they did not want to have the radical populist right-wing revolution at home that is proposed by, for example, Arrowcross. You can look at Horthy. Horthy puts Shalassi in jail. I mean, Shalassi is more radical than Horthy. Horthy refuses to cooperate at the end with the Nazi regime. The Nazi regime gets rid of Horthy and makes Shalassi, who is a real fascist, Arrowcross fascist, he becomes the head of the puppet state. So there are crucial moments where in the complicated history of the right before 1945, it is very useful to distinguish between a radical revolutionary fascism on the one hand and a conservative nationalism on the other. The Slovak state signaled that it was part of the fascist era, but it was never as radical as Ustasha in Croatia, for example. Nevertheless, there were elements within Slovakia, like the Linke Guard, which are much closer to radical fascism. So my short answer is no. Franco is not a fascist. I call people like Franco and Metaxas, I call them para-fascist, but I don't, it's just a suggestion. But they're definitely part of the fascist era without being radical fascists. That's my complicated answer. And I'm happy to discuss that. Maybe by email later with your colleague. It's probably too much now, but I'm very happy to engage in another context. I must apologize. I didn't realize how very, very long and complicated my talk was. I apologize. There are a couple of mistakes I made, having criticized Wikipedia and everything. That reburying of the fallen of the Putsch in Munich, that was the 9th of November, not the 11th of November. And I called Klaus Teweleit Karl Teweleit, and there are probably other mistakes, but we all make mistakes. Yeah,
it's a human. Well, thank you very much for the answer. Do we have some more? I don't see it Q&A, so I encourage people.
I'd love to hear from somebody. I'm sorry if you've fallen asleep with how long it was, but I'm very keen to have questions.
Yeah, of course. Until so the colleague has replied, just thanking you for
Right. Okay.
very useful.
But invite him.
Answer.
My email is discoverable. I'm quite happy to respond to people and even give some more stuff that I've written if they're interested. Okay, I'm just a theoretician. I'm not what I say is academic, and therefore it's never really true. There's absolute truth, there's fake truth, and then there's academic truth. And academic truth is always open to discussion, which is why you never kill for academic truth. You kill for politicians' fanatical truth, but academics should always be pluralistic about interpretations. Yeah.
Well, until our other colleagues join, I will use the opportunity here to give a little bit provocation in a way. So, of course, as you may imagine, I have a lot of things I would like to ask, but I will try to focus on two things actually. One is is coming out logically out of your presentation, in which you, I think, very precisely explained that there was no coup d'etat and that everything was kind of mythical construction afterwards. But actually what we miss here is why actually Victor Emmanuel decided to accept actually this thing and to let Mussolini start slowly with the process, which actually ended up in 25. And just to add how should I say, how truthful this presentation was actually, that if he were this kind of really a Nazi kind of strongholder, then 43 probably would have never happened. This is one question. And another one is, of course, something which very much interests everybody. And this is about the use current use of fascism nowadays. I had the chance and privilege to see your PowerPoint presentation for the next conference on fascism, in which you have very brutally criticized Timothy Snyder and people who were using actually this kind of F word for Putin and for some current
especially Trump,
subject.
yeah.
Trump as well. So I think since other couldn't see that for the time being, and please do not reduce yourself concerning the time. It's really very useful for all of us. So please take as much as you need.
Well, no, don't. That's dangerous. Never say to Roger Griffin, take as long as you like. I have a problem.
So please, these are two.
It's called logorrhea. It's like diarrhea. It's logorrhea. It's called, where you cannot stop the flow of words. So to take your two very interesting questions, the personality of the king is very interesting. You see, I have a very great, by temperament, I'm a Republican. I've had the extraordinary experience of being British with a queen who died very recently, Elizabeth II, and she was, I think, a remarkable constitutional monarch. She seems to have absorbed very early. Don't forget, her uncle had to abdicate, not only because he married an American woman, and who was not only American but a divorcee, but he was also a pro-Nazi. He was an absolute admirer of Nazism, and there were members of the aristocracy in England, famously Mosley, but also the Mitfords, etc. Mosley married Nancy Mitford in Goebbels, with Goebbels and Hitler there. I mean, there were horrible interconnections between the British aristocracy and monarchy families in Europe and fascism. Now, I put this down to the fact that historically, monarchs, if you take, for example, the interconnection of monarchies in Europe, I mean, they also included the Romanovs and the Hohenzollern, and before that, only a couple of generations before, they were part of the Holy Roman Empire, who were radically against liberalism, like radically against democracy. It was seen, obviously, as an existential threat to monarchy, because monarchy is based on a fundamentally mystic idea of power, which comes from above. Different monarchies adapt very different ways to the rise of liberal democracy. In Britain, it took hundreds of years. I mean, we had to get rid of one monarch after the English Civil War and import a monarchy from Holland because James II was too Catholic for the British. And so we got rid of him and brought in another monarch. So historically, monarchy and constitutional democracy do not go hand in hand. Now, if you look at the Italian Risorgimento, there was obviously interest in the Italian monarchy to have a united Italy, which happened, and the Risorgimento was in two strands. One is a monarchical one from Piemonte, run by Cavour. Cavour is a sort of Italian Bismarck, and he promotes a concept of a united Italy, which is very close in mentality to the Second Reich in Germany. You will have a constitutional monarch, not necessarily, well, an emperor, but a monarch, but there will be constitutional parliaments and there'll be parties, but real power will still be focused, and the concept of the nation will still be focused in the monarchy. But the other side of the Risorgimento is Garibaldi and radical democracy and republicanism. Okay, so by the time you get through the First World War into the 1920s, you have this Piemonte monarchy, Emanuele, and they were originally the monarchy of Piemonte, who is now the monarchy of Italy. But there was no commitment in the Piemonte's monarchy to radical liberal democracy. And I think that the chaos of Italian politics in 1919, which had led to the semi-civil war with the left, which the fascists had to go and deal with. And then 2 years after that, you have more chaos in Italy. So Mussolini is seen by Emanuele as a stabilizing factor who's put down the left. And the fact that Emanuele is intervening in a crisis of state in such an undemocratic way is consistent with a fundamental rejection of genuine democracy in the Italian monarchy. And I would also like to point out with the difference with England, when the bombs started falling on London, the British monarchy decided to stay in London and live in Buckingham Palace, quite extraordinary sense of solidarity between the people and the monarchy. But contrast that with the end of fascism and the armistice with the Allies in 1943. The monarch escapes with a whole load of money and drives to the Adriatic coast and escapes from Italy. Now, in other words, there was no emotional commitment to the Italian people. I find the behavior of not only that, but under Mussolini, Emanuele is completely happy to become emperor of Ethiopia. Now, to do that, the Italian fascists used modern warfare on a really untechnological army. They used mustard gas, they used bombs, they used mass killings. How Emanuele could be so anti-democratic and unmodern to actually celebrate and accept the title of emperor, I think it's absolutely disgusting. I mean, at least Queen Victoria was part of the age of empire. I have no apologies at all for British imperialism. But by the 1920s and 1930s, in Britain, there was a movement away from empire. So I see that incredible moment on October the 29th, when the factor gets the king to agree in principle to bringing out the army, and then he changes his mind. They'd already printed the leaflets and put them in Rome, and then Emanuele changes his mind, factor resigns, and that leaves a gap as prime minister, which is very neat for Emanuele, who can then appoint Mussolini. Now, note that he doesn't appoint him as fascist dictator, but I think that Emanuele was very impressed by the law and order which the fascists had re-established in physically fighting very violently the left and the communists in the Biennio Rosso. I mean, does that make sense, Miso? Is that a sort of interpretation? We should never assume that constitutional monarchs want to be constitutional. Would you like to come back on that?
Thank you very much.
Now, the other one, I think, you see, we're back to what I was saying about Stanley Payne and myself. I mean, Stanley Payne is a great historian. I am not a great historian. I'm somebody who's made a career out of worrying about this word fascist. But once we accept, now there is no objective definition of fascism. There's no objective definition of anything. But there is this thing called heuristically useful. When I came into fascist studies, Marxists had a variety of similar definitions and concepts of fascism because it was related to a crisis of capitalism. But in non-Marxist fascist studies, there was total chaos, really. Total chaos about the definition of fascism. I thought this was unnecessary, so I read fascists. This was very unpopular thing to do. I believed that fascists knew what fascism was and that we could define fascism in terms of what fascists said it was. And if you read enough fascists, you see that the pattern constantly repeats. A new order, get rid of liberal democracy, create a new era, a new order. Now, if you then define it ideotypically as a revolutionary form of populist nationalism, the populist is important. You can have a vanguard taking power, but the vanguard must then try to fascistize the masses. That's a very important point. And if you take, for example, Metaxas in Greece had no intention to create mass parties because he was a monarch. There's another monarch, an anti-democratic monarch, a bit like Emanuele. So if you then apply that criterion to Putin and Trump, you get two different case studies. Trump, even though he gave the alt-right a sense of legitimation, so they came out of the woodwork and they had the Charlotte Unite the Right rally, which led to the death of a protester. And even though many on the far right thought Trump was their president, Trump himself, to my knowledge, never had a consistent plan to conquer power. Even the attack on the Capitol is not about seizing power like Mussolini in January 1925. It was about delegitimizing the election of Biden. In other words, he was questioning the legitimacy of the vote. He was saying it was a fraud, but he wasn't trying to create a new order. Trump, for me, I do think you need a little bit of political intelligence to be a fascist. You need to have some sort of worldview. We've just had a very stupid liberal called Truss as British Prime Minister, but she wasn't a fascist at all. Trump, it seems to me, is just too intellectually stupid to be a fascist. He had no theory. He just had a series of gut impulses. He's a visceral politician. He's just had no clear ideology of creating a new order and getting rid of the United States Constitution. And this is crucial when we look at people like Orban or Le Pen or the AfD in Germany. These parties and movements and figures do not want to actually create a new order. They want to get rid of the liberalism in modern democracies and have an ethnic democracy. They want to stop immigration. They don't want to be part of the EU, et cetera, but they don't want a fascist new order. So I believe that Trump is a rather stupid populist and that the term fascist does not apply unless you have a different definition of fascism. And what annoys me about Snyder, I'm afraid, is that I don't really see what definition of fascism he's using. The fact that Trump is fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-liberal is not, for me, enough to show that he's a fascist. And we're really back to Franco here. Maybe the instinct of Trump was he'd like to be in power for a long time, but he never had a proper ideology of transformation of America into a single party state. Now, if we take Putin, Putin is far more interesting. He's not stupid, Putin. He may have, in democratic and humanistic terms, a perverse mentality, but he's not stupid like Trump, okay? But is he a fascist? Well, I think that unless you use the word fascist just to insult somebody on the right that you don't like, and that's fine. I mean, if you want to call him a bloody fascist, I probably agree. But if you're asking, does the term fascist apply as a technical term for an ideology on a par with, say, anarchism, feminism, ecologism, etc., I would say no. Why? Because Trump, again, very interestingly, he wanted to perpetuate the presidency under the Russian constitution. And he's fiddled the constitution to stay in power. But he has never attempted to replace the democratic apparatus of modern Russia with a new order. And in fact, he has never really tried to mobilize the Russians behind the idea of a new order, like, say, the Hitler Youth or what the Nazis and the fascists in Italy did to fascistize the masses. What he's created is a corrupt, deeply corrupt abuse of liberal democratic. He's got the propaganda apparatus of a fascist state, but he's never actually created a new Russia. And in fact, the fascistic energy he's using is not on the Russians, it's on Ukraine. And I think that this is somebody driven by what I've called resentment politics, not by a coherent fascist ideology. My other question is, why do we spend so much time worrying about labels? What does it matter whether he's a fascist or not? Look at the behavior. What I think has been problematic is that far too much energy of academics and journalists and even military intelligence has gone into trying to work out what he is theoretically, instead of looking at his behavior, looking at his... and if you look at his behavior, it was very clear from 2013 that Putin had given up trying to be part of the West, and that I think at that point, if we'd not worried about whether he's fascist or not, but just looked on him as a threat to international peace, NATO and the West would have made Ukraine uninvadable. They wouldn't have made them Ukraine part of NATO, but they would have done everything they can. They're now talking about doing that in the Baltic states, making sure these nations cannot be invaded. So I'm not ultimately interested in whether Putin is a fascist or not. What worries me is that the resentment of the West and the desire to destroy the sense of security and peace in the West was a far more powerful drive after 1913 than in any way being part of the West. And I don't know what you call that. There's this label, illiberal democracy. But I mean, again, who cares what he is? What we know he is that he wants Russia to be great again. He can't make it like it was under the Soviet Empire. So he's happy to display the power of Russia in a way that destroys other people's freedoms and democracy, like he did in Syria and like he's done now in Ukraine. I'm sorry, that was a long, complicated answer.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions, actually, from our participants. So first, there is a colleague, Rasko Lompar, who also participated in our conference and who is also our young scholar doing his PhD, but doing it very seriously, I have to say. And he and his colleagues working at the same project are also following the and participating in the conferences on fascism. You are also involved of the association and so on. So anyway, Rasko said, thank you for your talk, Professor. If we expand on your thoughts on the relationship between authoritarian nationalists and fascists, we can notice also that some fringe fascist movements, Zbor in Yugoslavia, criticized fascist regimes in Italy and Germany as backwards and conservative. Do you think this was a way of portraying themselves as authentic and not a simple carbon copy of fascism?
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, there's a whole issue here about how fascist movements describe themselves. I mean, for example, in the Phalange, some phalangists call themselves fascists, but then Primo de Rivera says, well, look, we don't want to call ourselves fascists because that would imply that we're trying to imitate Italy. But the Phalange is Spanish, and we don't want to use foreign words. And for example, Hitler, though I believe that Nazism is a form of fascism, Nazism did not call itself fascist. And in fact, in Germany, there's been a big academic problem about calling Nazism fascist because it was so uniquely destructive and different from Italy. The Marxists have always seen it as fascist, but it's only fairly recently that younger scholars in Germany have started recognizing Nazism as a form of fascism. And so there's always a problem. For example, the Romanian fascists, and I think they're absolutely classic fascists, the legionaries or the Iron Guard, they had three different names, Total Pentru Tara is the party as well. A powerful fascist movement will quite often avoid the word fascist in order to not be seen as alien, as it's proud of its unique nationalistic basis. But of course, that doesn't stop it being the supporter. For example, quite interestingly, the Romanian fascists went to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War because they recognized in the Franco right and the Phalange fellow fascists. So it's a complicated question, this. If there are some Yugoslavian extremists who want to dissociate themselves from fascism in Italy and Nazi Germany, both of whom, of course, had very strong reactionary elements, the fascists, especially in Italy, had associations with the monarchy and with the church, the Vatican, which make it actually quite close to Franco in a funny sort of way. And I can see why radical racist fascists reject the term fascism in its Italian sense. I have problems, though, with the Yugoslav fascists if they say that Nazism was not radical. I mean, yes, all fascists look back to a mythicized past. The Nazis were obsessed with the Aryans and the medieval Germany and everything else, but they were terrifyingly radical in their response to technology. They wanted to build, for example, a motorway system linking the whole of the Nazi physical Reich all the way over to the Ural Mountains. They used extraordinary technology. They killed millions of people using gas chambers, et cetera, et cetera. I think their radicalness is quite extraordinary. And though in their propaganda they want to show that it's a rooted radicalness, it's rooted in a mythicized past, I cannot understand how they can be called conservative. Of course, there were folkish conservatives within Nazism, but I think something like Himmler's SS strand of Nazism, I cannot imagine anything more radical. And of course, it is also futurist. They want a Jew-free Europe under Nazi power. You have Albert Speer rebuilding the center of Berlin using stone from concentration camps carved by prisoners, etc. This is a slave-based modern society, which I cannot get my head round in its radicalness. I mean, it's far more radical and it's far more modern in a way than Italian fascism. So I would say that how fascists describe themselves as very complicated and interesting. But I would like to see the primary sources of these Yugoslavs. Do they want a new, what is their future ideal political, cultural, social situation? If they want to radicalize the masses as well, the ordinary, I mean, if they're Yugoslav, I don't know what Yugoslavs are. It's a mythical concept in itself because it's ethnically not pure. But I would say if you've got scholars who are interested in this, have a good look at what their utopia is. Because for me, all fascists have a utopian future state of the nation and the race, and that is what is the discriminating aspect that engages my theory of fascism. But I'm perfectly accept the fact that it never really fits properly because every single fascist group has a particular feature. For example, there's a very, very big difference between Catholic fascism and, say, the BUF in England, which is anti-religion. It's quite, or Himmler's fascism, which is incredibly pagan and Nordic and is completely unconnected with Catholicism. And I believe that the Nazis would have eventually destroyed Catholicism and Christianity as part of their reshaping of the German Aryan people. And I believe that even in Eastern Europe, there's a tension between Catholic far right and anti-Catholic far right, far more pagan, far more Aryan, far more white supremacists. So these are complicated. Ultimately, all scholars should remember that we're trying to fit words onto complicated realities, and they don't really fit. To that extent, I'm a thing called a philosophical nominalist. Words do not perfectly match reality, and it's in the intelligent application of definitions and words we try to see more. But if we get stuck with the words and the definitions, we will see less. So ultimately, everybody writing a doctorate should, in the first part, clear up the use of words and taxonomy and definitions, and then get on with the research. Because if you get stuck, you will never get out of that, and writing a doctorate will be a nightmare, because ultimately it should be fun. It should be exciting. Getting too obsessed with words is a bit like always training for a football match but never playing it. You've got to have the fun of playing and not just the effort of all the training.
Okay, thank you. So another question. Okay, another question is from Professor Jovo Bakic from philosophy faculty at Belgrade. Would you agree that fascist mythopoiesis was in favor of big capital in Italy? On the one hand, it attracted mass attraction from broader social strata, seduced them, and on the other, it was quite in accordance with big capital interests. By the same token, it was mutatis mutandis the Nazi case in Germany.
Yeah, well, I would say that the central feature here in Nazi Germany and in Italian fascism is that fascism is a plural phenomenon. It is a plural entity. What Hitler started doing in the late 1920s is modifying his message to different sectors within German society: the workers, the youth, the peasants, big business, the middle classes, artists, intellectuals, technicians, scientists. There was a Nazi message for each sector, yes? Now, it's absolutely true that there was a disgusting level of participation of de-Judified big business in Germany. And we know very well that there were Auschwitz contained, factories put up there, IG Farben. We know all the scandals, and there is a complicated nexus between big capitalism and Nazism. But I would argue that Nazism, which needed a military-industrial complex and needed big industry to realize its goals, is far too complicated a phenomenon to be reduced to big capital. And that's why I reject the most Marxist theories. Similarly, in fascist Italy is a really messy alliance of different strands of nationalism, avant-garde art. You have, for example, the Marinetti and all that sort of technocrats who loved it because of the celebration of speed and motorways and aeroplanes. You have Catholics who approve of it because it's anti-communist. You have blood and soil. There was a film called Madre Terra, Mother Earth, which is a celebration of peasant values and the land. Of course, the Nazis also had a big cult of Blut und Boden and peasantry and corn in fields. You know, the key to my answer is that when you look at the problem of having a revolutionary nationalism, it will have to bring together many different strands of nationalism. And Nazism is extraordinarily complicated. There is a brilliant book I can give anybody it's in my book on modernism and fascism. The answer really is in my book on modernism and fascism. Somebody did a deep study of the leaders of Nazism and showed that each Nazi leader had a really different view of society, the future, anti-Semitism, technology, and capitalism. There was a genuine anti-capitalist element within Nazism. Goebbels really wrote some extraordinary rhetoric attacking capitalism. So I would just say to your philosophical colleague that, yes, I can understand if you only focus on the necessary nexus between Nazism, fascism, and big business and industry and technology, that you get a very almost Marxist picture of the interdependence of fascism and capitalism. But if you concentrate on other aspects of it, actually fascism and Nazism are deeply anti-capitalist. It's very bad for the stock market having a major war. You have to go forward to the point where fascism and Nazism as one, counterintuitive, counter-historical, counterfactual history. If the Axis had won, what would have happened to international finance capitalism, which the home of which was America? Would international finance capitalism have flourished with an Axis victory? Certainly laissez-faire capitalism was going to be dead in the water. The whole international trading and consumerism and the linkage between investment and mobile money, petrodollars and all that would have completely changed. So I think we have to be very careful about mistaking the very genuine involvement of conservative business and big business in fascism with the essence of fascism itself. I think fascism was a storm, a hurricane of revolutionary nationalism and racism, which is ultimately incompatible with the premises of finance capitalism. But I'll be very happy to debate that with your colleague privately through email.
Thank you. And since we are approaching actually 2 hours of work,
I don't mind.
We will finish. Yeah. It's here it's midnight,
Yes, you need to go to bed. Yeah.
Well, definitely, but it's not the reason why am I cutting off this.
No, that's okay. 2 hours is a long time.
But actually, we should appreciate your time and the time of all the people who were involved in this. And we are finishing with another thanks from our colleague Irina Milutinovic. Okay. And she actually, I think, asked something which might be interesting for all of us in the future. She said, I will just paraphrase, how do you perceive actual possibilities for some kind of new form of fascism in contemporary world of post-liberal democracy or post-democracy, as some people say? So actually, what are the prospects, notwithstanding the cases you have already disqualified as a fascist, and I think very rightly, but actually, what about real possibilities about some form of fascism in the future in contemporary world?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I'm going to try and give a simple answer because I'm sure you're all exhausted. I find listening to a foreign language really tiring, and it's also probably past your lunchtimes, so I'll try and keep it short. I believe that the interwar model of fascism, where you have a blend of a party with a paramilitary movement with uniforms and a charismatic leader, that has gone. But if we think of the purpose of fascism, which was to have a powerful nation ethnically purified of alien elements, you don't need the interwar fascist model to do that. And I'm going to say something which probably many people would disagree with, but I see a rather terrifying pattern in world politics already, which would allow me to say that a sort of modern fascism already exists. This is not the interwar model, and it doesn't correspond to my definition of fascism as a technical term in political science. But if you stand back, say you are mentally a sort of a Martian anthropologist trying to make sense of the modern world, and you come into the modern world and look at the way politics is going, look at the rise of xenophobia and ethnocentrism in some of the major powers. Look at modern China and the xenophobia towards non-Chinese and towards the Uyghur Muslim population within China, and the urge to take over Taiwan and the anti-pluralism. There is a move towards xenophobic, ethnocentric politics in China. There's a similar move within Russia. Putin is one thing, it's a reassertion of Russianness. It's been influenced by Eurasianism and all sorts of ideas about Russian specialness. Look at the populist parties in Italy, in Denmark, in Sweden, in the Brexit movement, in Trump. The idea of America for the Americans, France for the French, the tendency within liberal democracies to have parties like the AfD. If you read the manifesto of the Alternative for Germany of 2018, there's this simple phrase which for me chills my blood. Der Islam gehört nicht zu Deutschland. Islam does not belong in Germany. Now, that is, for me, it may not be fascist, it may not be Nazi, but this is the deliberalization of democracy. So I think that what is emerging in the world, and it will get worse with the war over ecology and resources, etc., is an involution of countries, so that there is a terrible split between, look at even in Poland now with the Law and Justice Party, there's some dangerous ideas about homosexuality betraying the nation in some way. It's not Polish. It's not good. A fear of cosmopolitanism, a fear of mass migration, a fear of the EU as being somehow supranational. So I actually think that we shouldn't be looking all the time over our shoulder at interwar fascism. We should be witnessing a terrifying movement towards xenophobic ethnocentrism and culture centrism all over the world in different forms. And that, in a way, this is a far more disturbing movement now because of resources problems and climate issues. That actually we should not be obsessed with the interwar period, but see how unprepared we are, because without an international collaboration and humanism, we will not survive as a species. And that's what terrifies me. Nazism was already terrifying, but I think the move towards ethnocentric xenophobia throughout the world in different forms means that we don't need a new fascism. In a way, a sort of modern fascism is already here. And on that very pessimistic answer, I'm sure you do have to go. I am amazed that 23 people are still with us, and I'd like to thank you all very much and wish you well in your studies. And if anybody does want to write to me individually, I'm sure you can find it, rdgriffin@Brooks ACUK. I'm on the web, and I'm very happy to send this PowerPoint, or I hope that your institute makes it available to people. But it's been a great honor for me to talk to a part of Europe I've not yet been able to go to, and I wish you all well. And I hope that the forces of humanity and democracy, tolerance, pluralism, and love, because I'm an old hippie, prevail over the forces of ethnic hatred and toxic masculinity and plutocracy and all the various forces of corruption that I'm sure your institute is trying to fight. Okay? So goodbye, everybody, and sleep well, Misa. Thank you for hosting the session.
Okay, just the final words. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us. Really, it was really great pleasure having you with us, listening to us. And I especially have to emphasize that more than half of the people who were today with us are either young doctors or PhD students finishing that soon. And this was, I think, very important for them and great privilege for all of us. So I hope that they will continue really with this kind of studies and that this will stay as very
final words
incentives for them.
I would encourage all your young researchers not only to think of academia. We need people like you with complicated understandings of the modern world outside academia as well. We need you in politics, in journalism, in business. We need you out there. Educate means leading out into the world. So please don't do what I did, because I was too frightened of the world and I stayed within academia and I stayed within my study and I read a lot of books. But I would really encourage you to see your mission now in the world we're in, to take your values out of the academia and into the world. So that is my final bit of message.
Thank you very much. At the end, keep in touch and really hope to see you in the future.
Well, that would be my pleasure. And I hope one day I can come in my flesh and not just through Zoom. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great day, everybody, or a great night, Misa. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you very much, and goodbye to everybody. Bye-bye. We are finished now.